Okay. So it's nice to have you all with us. We're very excited about having Natan present to us, teach us something we probably don't know. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Natan. Oh, I should mention that the recording of this will be posted to YouTube, but likely not till tomorrow. And I will send out a message with the link when it is. Natan, take it
Hey,
away.
okay, so as a little housekeeping, I'm going to try to keep my voice steady and understandable and speak slowly. If people have trouble hearing, I don't know, I guess waving frantically won't help much. But send comments along to Bobby and then she will let me know. And if you have questions or want to clarify things, I am going to pause between sections just to make sure we're all, you know, I was clear or what some reference I made that is not clear to people. I'll clarify it. Some general questions and comments can be saved. It'll be easier to deal with them at the end. And the second thing before I start is just to define what a gaucho is, so we can all start at the same place. And if one looks in the dictionary nowadays, it's essentially a rural farmhand that works in herding cattle or sheep. And that is a term that's used in Chile and Uruguay and southern parts of Brazil and Rio Grande do Sul. In Argentina, though, people tend, when they speak of a gaucho, besides the national archetype they're going to talk about later, it's pretty much anyone who lives in a rural area, whether they actually live in a farm or not, if it's a small enough town,
Yeah, yeah.
they tend to be consider themselves gauchos and be considered gauchos as opposed to people who live in big cities or in Buenos Aires. So this talk is called The Invention of the Jewish Gaucho, and I want to start with an Argentinian Jewish writer called Alberto Gerchunov, who wrote a book, The Jewish Gaucho, or Gaucho Judío, in 1910. And I'm going to kind of credit this idea to him, or at least popularizing this idea of the Jewish gaucho. Uh, there are two important things about this book. Uh, when it was written and the language in it was written that sets it aside and makes it important. One of them is that it is written in Spanish. The intended audience to this book was the general Argentinian public, more than the Jewish public, which was still mostly reading in Yiddish. So most of the Jews in Buenos Aires, in the agricultural colonies, they're going to talk about that in a moment, the press was still in Yiddish, people were still reading in Yiddish. And there have been references to the colonies and its meaning and in the Jewish press internationally for at least since the first colonies began in the late 1880s, early 1890s. So, I mean, I think the idea of it was not the first person to call a Yiddish gaucho. That already appeared, but he was important because it was in the Spanish language press in Argentina. And the year in which it was done was 1910, this was the centenary of the Argentinian Republic. And as there was in Philadelphia in 1876, in the centenary of the Proclamation of Independence, there was a big outburst of patriotic fervor and construction and monument building. And this collection of stories, which is essentially stories, interconnected little vignettes, some short stories, some more dramatic than others, uh, about Jews living in rural colonies in the interior of the country. Uh, Alberto Gorchunov had begun, was then only like 25, 26 years old. Uh, he was a writer beginning when he was about 20 years old in the Buenos Aires National Press. He worked and wrote a lot for the most prestigious paper in Argentina, then and probably now as well, which was La Nación, the Nation. This is the equivalent of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal in one place. And he wrote mostly in their kind of literary supplement that came out once a week. He had already written some of the stories as vignettes about Jewish life, among other things that he wrote. He wrote literary criticism, opinion pieces, kind of commentary in general. And his editor encouraged him to write more of them. And it was the editor of La Nación that helped him put it together as a collection of stories and published them that year. So it was really seen as a the Jewish community in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, proclaiming itself part of this national myth of the Gaucho, of not only urban life in Buenos Aires, of which there were already maybe a substantial amount of Jews by 1910, maybe as much as 35,000 people, and on their way to being a lot more over the next 2 decades until there were a couple of 100,000 Jews living in Buenos Aires. But and it was done both by Gershunov and by his editors. I mean, by people who had been nurturing him as a writer and who were very well established. So before we talk a little, about the meaning of this being a gaucho, an Argentinian gaucho, and a Jewish gaucho, is the first question is, how did all these Jews end up in the farm? Because that is the beginning, the first question. And the Jewish colonies began in very late in the 1880s. They're associated with the Jewish Colonization Association, which was set up by Baron Hirsch, who was a baron, I believe, of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and who had the idea of providing an escape for Jews in Eastern Europe, mostly in the Russian Empire, but also in Austria-Hungary, by creating an area where Jews could be settled in large colonies and turn to agriculture. And this entire idea of Jewish farming, which was extremely popular at the end of the 19th century and happened in many places. Argentina was very prominent, but also in New Jersey and, of course, in Israel, and even in the southern part of Russia along the Black Sea coast of what is now Ukraine. But the initial group that came there to settle in Argentina were not sent, organized, underwritten by Baron Hirsch. They came a couple of years before. There were a group of Jews from Podolia who were interested in breaking out of traditional life in the Russian Empire. And Podolia is an extremely backward part of the Pale of Settlement. Even by the standard of the Pale of Settlement, was an area of very limited development. And and they organized themselves. There is an entire adventure involved in this, which I only say very briefly because it's not the main point. But a whole group of members of the community, some of the more enlightened people who have been influenced by the Haskalah, they thought of returning to the soil, returning to a more organic community. They sent a delegation to Paris to try to get financial support from wealthy Jews. And they were at this point they were not quite clear where they were going to go, but when they got there, they were put in touch through the Alliance Israélite, which was a French Jewish group that was mostly interested in improving the lot of Jews in North Africa, Sephardic Jews and Mizrahi Jews in North Africa, that there were people from Argentina looking to recruit settlers to go to colonize Argentina. And they got in the delegates from this group got in touch with the Argentinians. They signed an agreement with a very wealthy landowner in the province of Santa Fe, and they were on their way. The initial group, which is kind of legendary, they came on a ship called the Vesser, and landed in Buenos Aires. They go out to Santa Fe, where their land is supposed. They land in Buenos Aires. Apparently, while they were organizing themselves and on board, the wealthy Argentinian landowner either had second thoughts or he found it better, a group that offered him more money for the settlement rights. But they didn't have a contract. They try to get another one. They go to add to the site. They have a lot of hardships because they didn't have land. They're kind of stuck there near a train station. And it's at this point that this particular group comes to the attention of someone who works for Baron Hirsch or is an acquaintance of Baron Hirsch. And then they link up with Baron Hirsch and the actual settlement in Moisesville. The first settlement takes place, and then Baron Hirsch and the Jewish Agricultural Society take charge of this idea of mass settlements. But it was not. It was a convergence of a couple of things. One of them is this idea by Baron Hirsch that he was toying with the idea of solving the Jewish problem in the Russian Empire by resettling them, not just emigrating away to other countries like the United States, but settling them in compact Jewish communities in the agricultural pursuits. Jews in the Pale who were interested in this idea, and Argentinian landowners and Argentinian provincial governments who sent people to Europe to recruit European settlers to settle in Argentina. Now, I think I've thrown a lot of stuff at you very fast. So, any confusions, any questions, and anything before I move on, because we are going to have to go back to answer a couple of questions. One of them is why were the Argentinians recruiting people to settle in the country? And then we can talk a little bit about what the life in the Jewish colonies was like, and that created this idea of the Gaucho. So I'm going to pause. And Bobby, if anyone has a question.
I'm gonna remove the spotlight so I can see hands
Yeah.
more easily.
Yeah.
And if anybody, Patricia, go ahead. And then Karen.
Yeah, just a quick question. Do we know how people heard about this opportunity? when they were in Russia or in Eastern Europe?
They didn't know when they were there that this was a possibility. They went, I mean, they went to, they sent a delegation to Paris to try to find support by, somebody like a Rothschild. I mean, there was already at this point, there's a lot of talk about Jewish agricultural settlements in various parts of the world. There is Israel. There is New Jersey, where the first colonies came in about 5, 6 years earlier. So when they went there, it was when they were there that someone at the Alliance said, there is this representative of the provincial governor of Santa Fe who is recruiting people, recruiting groups, not people. They were recruiting settlement groups, organized groups that would come in and create an agricultural colony in the province. Go talk to them.
Okay, thanks.
And Karen?
Yeah, Natan, after the first deal fell through with the initial landowner, and then the group somehow connected with Baron Hirsch, did they make the deal with the original guy, or did they go to somebody else?
This is they were in Buenos Aires. This took several months. I think they went anyway there. It was unclear what kind of deal they were. They were still trying to make a deal with someone before Baron Hirsch came through, and it was and set up the Colonization Association and bought a huge tract of land in a very big program of developing of Jewish colonies. So this is a complicated story,
Okay.
that has been told, because this is the initial kind of like a founding myth, and it has been told in various versions. Because they ended up out there and where they were supposed to be settling near a railroad station, and they were kind of had some food. They ran out of food. There was an epidemic of typhus. There was a lot of hardship. This became a news story in Buenos Aires. It became a news story in the provincial capital city of Santa Fe. There were people from the governor's office that intervened. They were trying to find some financing. And then at the end of this process that took months, a couple of years, then the actual settlement site was bought, and it was named in honor of Baron Hirsch's son, who had died, Mosesville. I mean, he had a young son who died, and it was named Moisesville in his honor. But this is this is a story of, besides being partially reported in the Jewish Gauchos, is, there are books written about it, and it's very fundamental to the self-image of the Jewish community, of kind of its founding myth. And we'll talk a little bit about it later. But the question is, what kind of any other questions before I go? What Argentina was?
I actually have a question. This is Bobby, and if I'm getting ahead of you, just tell me to wait.
Yeah.
That's fine. So the people who did settle in these settlements in Argentina, did they stay in Argentina, and are their descendants still part of the Argentine Jewish community, which I know expanded after World War II, et cetera, but
that is the last point.
Okay.
Because,
I had a feeling I was getting
because I did, yes.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah. Because that is the interesting, one of the interesting questions about how important these colonies were 150, not
I
quite,
will
150
wait
years later, 120 years later.
I will wait patiently. Any
yeah.
other questions before Natan moves on? Enid has a question. Go ahead, Enid.
I think she's muted still.
Yeah, I'm
No,
unmuted.
You're okay now.
Okay. At that time, I think there were pogroms going on in Russia. Plus, I know sometimes young men wanted to get out so they wouldn't be drafted into the Russian army. Did that have anything to do with the fact that these people wanted to leave at that time?
Well, yeah, I mean, this was one of the components of Jews leaving the Russian Empire. I mean, and mass migrations to other places like the United States and Australia and South Africa, Canada, and there is that, and then there was it is a wider movement of agricultural settlements, and it has motivations in Jewish life, which I think we're all familiar with. So I figured since we have an hour, we'll skip that part. But the question actually, it's a good transition to why was Argentina, and especially, and I think we're going to turn out Argentinian elites in this couple of particular provinces interested in attracting immigrants at this point in time and organized groups of rural immigrants. And so we're going to have to go not forward, but backwards. 100 years from 1910 to 1810, Argentinian independence. Argentina in colonial times was part of a viceroyalty of La Plata, which is named after the river estuary, the river where Buenos Aires is located. This is a huge territory that included what is now Uruguay, kind of what is now Paraguay, and most of what is now Bolivia, plus Argentina. They proclaimed this as an independent country in 1810, like many other parts of South America, and it devolves into a fairly bad political mess. Between 1810 and that's about 1850, what is now Argentina is in terrible political instability. There are fights between various political factions. There are fights between the provinces that are now states in the Argentinian Federation, but they're individual provinces. There are alliances between one group and another. The Buenos Aires, which is the most populated province that includes the city of Buenos Aires at this point, the local chief, caudillo, fights against all the other caudillos, which are essentially, a strong man, in horseback usually, because most of these wars were fought by cavalry. And it is not clear until about early 1850s if there's even going to be an Argentina. It's very easy to think that it's not easy to think because people don't look backwards like that, but it's quite possible that Argentina could have ended up being split into 3 or 4 countries. Just like Central America, when it became independent from Mexico in 1821, was a federation. And all the countries between Guatemala and Costa Rica were a single country. And within 20 years, they became, each province became a country on its own. And Argentina could have easily split into 2 or 3 things, as it was during this period. Bolivia very quickly, spun off on its own because this was totally an area that was really looking towards Peru and the north, and it really had nothing to do with Buenos Aires. and that became its own country. Paraguay was very different from the rest. And after a lot of back and forth, Uruguay became an independent country. After, again, Uruguay could easily have become a province of Argentina or have been annexed by the Empire of Brazil, but it came out as a separate country in a compromise between Brazil and Argentina. But by the end of the 1840s, all the central government in Buenos Aires had managed to unify the rest of the country, defeat the independent local governor and the federations. And at the same time, from 1815 to about 1870, the boundaries of modern Argentina were drawn. They theoretically had control of the Patagonia, and they made an agreement with Chile that set the boundaries between the two countries along the Andes Mountains. So it turned most of Patagonia over to Argentina. Uruguay was a separate country. And then into the north, there was, in the 1860s, a war against Paraguay, which was a very bloody conflict in which Paraguay took on Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay at the same time and clearly lost. And Argentina gained its two northern provinces from, capturing land from Paraguay. So by the 1860s, Argentina, as the boundaries of Argentina as exists today had been drawn. They had only lost, as it turns, Uruguay and the Falkland Islands, or the Maldives, which are still owned by the British, but otherwise they managed to unify the whole area. But in this situation, the kind of country that this was at this point was thinly populated in most parts. So most of the interior, most of the Great Plains, which are the Pampas, had very thinly settled population. There were indigenous people who had not been integrated into the society, who were not, unlike the indigenous peoples in the Andes who were settled farmers. They tended to be either herders or hunter-gatherers. That there were a lot of what they now hunted instead of indigenous birds, large birds, were wild cattle and use horses. They learned to ride horses. It does sound vaguely like the United States, and there's this kind of similarities with that. The areas where there was population was around Buenos Aires, along the coast, and Buenos Aires was by far the largest city. Up in the northwest part, there were areas that had been settled since indigenous times. They were part of the Inca Empire, so there were a lot of rural population and villages. In between, there was this essentially wild country where there were a few outposts, a few capital cities along the rivers, and goods between the northwest farming areas and areas that provided some of the agricultural produce and moved on wagon trains. One of the ways that the settlement, the unification was done is that Buenos Aires, which had so much weight in the country because of the population, so the city of Buenos Aires became its own federal capital, and the rest of the area around it became the state of Buenos Aires. And that way, that was one of the settlements at this point. But the city in 1870s, even though it was large by Argentinian standards, was only about 180,000 people. In the south, in what is now Patagonia, it was just wild. I mean, there were a couple of little outposts and again, indigenous people who were hunters and gatherers. And this, I think, some of what Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego, which is the bottom of Argentina, you can see when Darwin went in the Beagle in the expedition, he has some interesting descriptions of the wild coast in the south. The English were trying to, besides having Darwin collect things, the main point of that trip was to actually try to chart all this coast so that people could navigate around Cape Horn and safely. So that doesn't exist. And in the next, essentially from the late 1840s, 1850s through 1870s, the country is transformed, and there are three sort of basic ideas and one book that deal with that. One of them is the president of Argentina, Domingo Faustino Sarmiento, who's a very big deal in the country and is really the founder of this country. In the 1840s, before he came to power and consolidated the country, he had written a book called Facundo, Civilization and Barbarism. Now, Facundo was one of those regional governor caudillos from the 1830s and 1840s, and he wrote this biography about his movement. Not a highly favorable one, as you can imagine, given the title. But he saw that Argentina was poised between this barbarism that he associated with the interior, especially those provinces in the Pampas, and civilization that he associated with Buenos Aires and urban society. The president that succeeded him, Alberti, who sort of created a program for governing in the 1850s, is identified with a phrase. I don't know if he actually used it as a title as part of this program. Maybe he did it as a subheading, but this became associated with the new centralizing government in Buenos Aires, which is to govern is to populate. You need to settle people to actually have a country to govern. And the third phrase is associated with an ex-president, somewhat later, in this trend, whose name is Roca, who is, again, a national hero until recently, because still a national hero for people on the right, less of a national hero for people on the left. Before he became president, he was the person in charge. He was the military leader of what he dubbed the conquest of the desert. That is, I said there was this area in between the Northwest, which was settled, the coastal areas, which were settled. There was the areas to the south that were unsettled. There was a newly occupied territory that was ceded by Paraguay, which still had mostly indigenous people. And there was this large area in the middle of the country that a lot of it was in the eyes of people in Buenos Aires, lawless. And in fact, it was probably pretty lawless. Most of the people living there, as this thin population, there was some farming, but most of them were gauchos. I mean, it was then, country folk who had adopted a lot of the ways of the indigenous populations, who were familiar with the terrain, who tended to move from place to place. They were unsettled. The way they made a living was partially by being wage workers in large estates. The estates did not cultivate a lot of land in the 1840s, 1850s. They owned terrain. There were wild cattle out there. There were wild horses. They hired this vagrant population. And vagrant was the term that was used by the people who were doing the hiring. It is, who are the gauchos, and they would work for some months. They would round up the cattle. They would kill them. At this point, most of this, when the cattle were rounded up, some of the meat was transported over to Buenos Aires or to cities on the coast, La Plata and elsewhere, or along a major river, and they were salted, as hardtack, and that was used in slave plantations in places like Brazil. And then they did a lot of leather, or just raw hides that were exported from the country. So that's what, there was very little actual farming going on, and very thin population. The gauchos, besides providing labor, they provided during all those wars in the 1830s and 40s and 20s and into the early 50s, they provided the manpower for this cavalry. They were montoneros, those were the informal troops that were recruited during the civil wars. They practiced rural banditry. Those wagon trains going through, they may attack them and rob them. Some of the people who did the banditry were also people who did the rural farming. The image of the gaucho was rather low. They were considered more of a problem than a solution. They were part in Sarmiento's view that were part of the barbaric problem in Argentina. So while there is a consolidation of the state in Argentina, there is an effort to tame the wilderness. So the Roca in the 18th goes out. He tames the Pampas. He tames the native population in the north, in the newly acquired territories that they got from Paraguay. He starts pushing south. It's kind of like the conquest of the West. They push the frontier outward. The gauchos are part of this conquest. They provide the trackers and some of the troops. But as they move to civilize the Pampas, they start putting restrictions on the gauchos. There are essentially pass laws. That's, the gaucho, there's people who can no longer be moving from place to place. They have to live in one place. They need to have a pass. They need to have an employer. And also at this point, the world economy changes because three things happen that are very important to Argentina. Railroads, because they start building railroads that start crossing the Pampas. No more wagon trains. There are railroads, railroad stations, telegraph lines going through. Modern steam shipping. That means that you can get from Europe to Argentina much faster, much more reliably, and much more cheaply. So people can travel to Argentina in steamships quite cheaply, and we have refrigeration in ships and refrigeration on land, it means that Argentina can start exporting beef. So it is during these 1870s that the Argentinian agriculture begins to plant wheat that's going to be exported. They begin raising cattle to be brought to Buenos Aires to be slaughtered. And they want to settle people in the land. And it's something that looks a little bit like Homesteader Act, but never quite works out the same way. They think that the best way to do is to organize groups that will come in and settle. And it is as part of this idea that begins in the 70s and takes off more in the 80s that the governors are sending people out to recruit settlers from Italy, from Spain, from Germany, and they're going to recruit Jews. And this is where the idea from Baron Hirsch and this idea of settling the Pampas with farmers links up. So what makes Hirsch a little different is set up this organization, the Colonization Association. They buy large tracts of land. They recruit Jews in Eastern Europe to come there. They recruit Jews in areas where some Jews still practice agriculture. They're pretty careful about trying to get people with some rural experience. They sign agreements where the settlers are going to receive the land on credit, and then they'll pay for it over so many years, and then they'll own the land. They're not going to be tenants, they're going to be owners. But the organization, the Jewish Colonization Association, sort of plots out the towns like Mosesville and other towns. They create a town, they provide infrastructure, they provide agricultural advisors, many of them recruited from Western Europe, mostly Jews. They provide teachers. They provide teachers who are going to teach Jewish subjects. They're going to teach in Yiddish, who are trained in more modern curriculum method in places in Central Europe and in Galicia and Lithuania, where there's some more modernizing Orthodox groups. And they also, through the Alliance schools in France, they recruit Sephardi teachers who have been trained, who speak Spanish or a variant of Spanish, or can know something similar to Spanish and become. And they also bring them in. So there is a whole Jewish infrastructure that are built into this little settlement towns. And those are organized by the Colonization Association, and over the there is a dream of settling 250,000 Jews a year over a few years period. In fact, it never is quite that successful, quite that big, but eventually about 40,000 Jews would live in the farm colonies. They're concentrated not around Buenos Aires, but in two provinces in the center of the country, around Santa Fe province, which Moisesville is initially, and a place called Entre Rios, where it's another area of colonies. And the neighbors of the Jewish settlers are not only the indigenous people, some who still live there, who are not being quite cleared out completely, especially in Santa Fe, and the traditional Gauchos, but also other similar settler colonies of Italians and Volga Germans and Spanish peasants from northern Spain. So it is not that Jewish colonies are unique is that they're Jewish colonies organized through the Colonization Association, and their neighbors tend to be similar colonies from Italy and mostly from Italy and mostly from Spain. So there are two questions to get through is, so I gave you a very disparaging view of who the Gauchos are, which was who are the view in Buenos Aires and in the urban areas. And the question is, so how did this semi-outlaw, barbaric people that you were trying to get rid of in the 1850s, by the 1890s, when the Jewish colonies actually began to take off, and certainly by 1910, thank you, 1910, were kind of a national hero. And that is because the Jewish, if we can credit Gershunov with inventing the Jewish Gaucho, there is another author who gets credited with inventing the regular Gaucho or the Argentinian Gaucho. In 1872, an Argentinian author called Jose Hernandez wrote a epic poem called Martin Fierro, which means Martin of Iron. Now, Jose Hernandez was a journalist and a writer and a politician who had the bad luck in the very last of the civil wars to back the wrong Federalist side. So he had kind of been pushed out of office. He had been sort of shunted aside. And at this point, then he thinks that, he had not very many prospects. He writes this epic poem in the style of Gaucho poetry. And it's essentially a denunciation of the government of Sarmientos, the president, and its neglect of the population in the countryside and the abuse of the population in the countryside. A lot of it has to do with his own sense that he was treated unfairly and he was abused. There's a lot of personal animus in this. But his hero, Martin Fierro, is a peaceful Gaucho, a rural person, and essentially a principled and honest man, not a barbarian, who is forced to become a fugitive and to defend himself using his knife against the forces of law and order, and who eventually flees the newly civilized part of the Pampas for the barbarians, which are the untamed indigenous population or Indians in the frontier. And he publishes this in 1872 in a cheap edition. But what is interesting is that it becomes a huge bestseller. There's tens of thousands of copies of this poem printed. It becomes a bestseller not only in the provincial cities, but in the countryside, where when people who are more educated, who can read this poem to the people who don't know how to read. I mean, among the Gauchos and in the rural population. And versions of this poem become oral poetry and get transmitted orally. And the hero just becomes a character in folklore. But it also becomes a hero in Buenos Aires, which is a big city. Mostly, about half of those people are recent immigrants from Italy and Spain. And Martin Fierro, it also becomes a bestseller and a popular hero among the urban, the urban working classes and in the popular classes, because, I mean, what's to dislike here? This is an anti-authoritarian hero, and in Buenos Aires, the first working class groups tend to be anarchists. So people even though this is about the Gaucho and the native population, the new immigrants in the city identify with him as well. So when Gershunov comes to write his book, The Jewish Gaucho, the Gaucho is no longer seen as essentially a backwards, uncivilized problem to be solved, but is being seen throughout Argentina as a symbol of what the nation is. So I put a lot of stuff here before we go into how I want to talk a little bit about Gershunov and then a little bit about how this continues to, as I promised Bobby, and continues, this idea of the Jewish Gaucho continues to exist. So there are any questions now about mostly about the Jewish settlers? Okay, I put a lot of stuff on you, so so I wanted to talk a little bit about Gershunov because I talked too much about Argentina. So as I said, in 1910, he is in his mid-20s. He is writes in Spanish. He is working for an Argentinian audience more than a Jewish Yiddish-speaking audience. He himself was born in Europe. He came as a 5 or 6 year old to Moisesville. His father was one of the settlers in the early 1890s. They did not live very long in Moisesville because his father was killed in a fight with a Gaucho. So it was one of the in a conflict with in a knife fight. His mother then moved from Moisesville to another Jewish colony in the province of Entre Rios, where there were more, where was an area of more colonists, in a town called Rahil, and he lived there for the next 6 years. He went to grade school there. His first language, of course, was Yiddish. He was speaking in Yiddish, but when he was going to school in Rahil, his teacher in the public school, so the colonies had public schools that taught Jewish subjects in Yiddish and taught the national curriculum, the provincial curriculum at this point. But the standard Argentinian curriculum was being taught, but it was being taught by Jewish teachers who had been contracted to come from France and North Africa and the Balkans. And his teacher, I believe, came from North Africa. He encouraged him to write in Spanish. He encouraged them to read Cervantes. And when he left Entre Rios, when he was older teen, and his mother moved to Buenos Aires, where he went to work in all things in a matzo bakery factory, but also continued his education and eventually became a journalist and a writer quite quickly. I mean, he really moved into Argentinian writing circle, into the intellectual, journalistic writers groups in Buenos Aires, writing for various newspapers. Besides the Jewish Gauchos, he wrote some memoirs that were published in the press about which is called that Entre Ríos, mi país. Entre Ríos, the name of the province, my country, which were reminiscences about his early teenage years in the colonies. So this picture of the Jewish gaucho became quite popular among Jews in Argentina. It was really one way of linking themselves to the nation. There was always some pushback at this idea by people said that they weren't really gauchos. They were farmers. They were rural farmers, rural storekeepers. A lot of the conflicts between that in the early days were between Jewish storekeepers and the more vagrant rural population. So this didn't quite fit in, but it did not much matter. I mean, you had to adopt the dress of the gauchos because that made sense. Even though you were a farmer, you were out there rounding up cattle as well as plowing fields. And the sort of appearance, the whole idea of gauchos, of Jews dressed as gauchos, living like gauchos, riding on horseback, was adopted by people in the cities. Jews in Buenos Aires or Jews in the other cities of the interior. This was not something that was peculiar to Jews. The Jewish neighbors who were from Italy, equally inexperienced. The fact that you had been a farmer in the mountains of central Italy or in the valleys, on the Po River Valley, did not prepare you to farm this flat soil of the Pampas any more than being a farmer prepared you to be a farmer in Nebraska. I mean, you had to learn they also had to learn from the gauchos like the Jews. It was quite similar. And they also reinvented themselves as gauchos. So it was fairly universal. The idea, it was an attractive way of becoming acculturated. And even in Buenos Aires, which developed which grew up to be an enormous city very quickly in 40 years, from 180,000 people to almost 1.5 million people, where more than half of the people had been born abroad and had developed its own what's called porteño culture. Many of the immigrants from Italy in parts of the city spoke something called lunfardo, which is a mixture of Italian and Spanish. Many others spoke something called cocoliche, which is kind of the equivalent of Spanglish or Span-Italian, with different rules. They developed an urban culture. Most famous outcome of that is the tango, but they all identified as gauchos as well. So it wasn't weird for Jews to try to identify as gauchos. It was their way that they and other immigrants adopted to being Argentinians.
The last Olympics in Beijing. He's just 20 years old, the two-time reigning world champion in the 500, the 1,000, the 1,500. It's Joey, it's more than 8 years.
Somebody has
Somebody has
something on and I can't find
yes.
it.
No, I thought it was a question, but it seems to involve something else. Okay. So before I'm going to get to questions in a moment, I want to
Natan, I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second.
Yeah.
Because of this noise and I can't identify where it's coming from, I'm going to mute everybody and you'll have to unmute
The
yourself.
stronger skaters come at the end, but here's the two-time reigning world champion.
Okay, Natan, if you can unmute yourself and continue, that would be great.
Okay, I can say that now. Okay, there is something even slightly not off topic. So recently I was preparing something else. I was looking at a very recent book about the general strike in Buenos Aires in 1919, right? The beginning of the 20th century. And the book was written about 100 years later. But the second chapter of the book has a chapter called the Gauchos Gringos. Now, and we know the gringo from Mexican slang as meaning Yankees, American. In Argentina, gringos means foreigners. So to call somebody a gaucho gringo is kind of an oxymoron. But what the authors here were saying, and using terminology that was used at the beginning of the 20th century, is among the rural proletariat, the rural land workers that have been recruited in places like Spain and the Canary Islands and Italy that came to Argentina to work outside of Buenos Aires in the big estates, harvesting the wheat, working in the fields, working with the cattle. There were activists and agitators and hobos who identified themselves as gauchos, and 100 years later, people who were trying to reconstruct this radical revolutionary atmosphere around Buenos Aires and the countryside was still calling them gauchos, gringos. So the idea of being a Jewish gaucho really, really takes off. It's adopted by Jews in Argentina. During the 1930s, there is a lot of Jewish popular culture in Yiddish in Argentina. The most famous person is a fellow named Katz, not Mickey, Hevel Katz. And besides, doing kind of parodies of tangos and sort of klezmer-inflected tangos, he also has songs celebrating Moisesville, the Jerusalem of the Pampas, and many of those rural Jewish villages, also have popular songs that are composed about those places in Yiddish or in Yiddish and Spanish combination. So that's into the 20s. My timekeeper told me that I have only 12 minutes. What happens to the colonies? And the colonies continue to recruit people and to be reinforced from the Jewish Colonization Association right into the 30s. The peak population is reached around in the 1930s. The last new colony to be established is Avigdor, which is established in Buenos Aires province, and it's mostly provides a place where people who are fleeing Germany can come. So the reinforcements, the deal with the joint Jewish Colonization Association persists into World War II, when essentially it's dissolved. Jews become landowners. The population tends to decrease over time. There are a couple of things going on here. There is a popular saying in Argentina, which in the colonies, like you hear many times, is that the colonists say, we planted wheat and we reap doctors. I mean, a lot of the people in the second generation did not stay. They moved to the cities, the main cities, or to Buenos Aires, especially to Buenos Aires. Because life in the city is more attractive, there are more opportunities. They were relatively well educated because the schools in the colonies are relatively good as compared to other areas. It was not unique to Jews. People in the Italian colonies or Spanish also moved to this city because opportunities were better and life was easier. The inventor of the Jewish gaucho, Alberto Gershunov, is an example of that. I mean, he lived in the colonies till he was 16. He was very nostalgic But when he was a late teenager, his mother moved to the city. She opened a little shop. He went to work in the city. He got more education. He became a journalist. Other people had the same life story. In the colonies themselves, the Jewish institution persisted quite effectively for about 75 years. As time went on, and you moved from oxen to tractors, the farms got larger, so they were consolidated and there were fewer Jewish farmers farming the same area. Other people moved in, but many of those towns retain a very strong Jewish flavor in real life right into the end of the 20th century. At this point, probably there are the population of the colonies and the adjacent towns, the Jewish population is very small. Mostly it persists in museums and as tourist attractions. There are some, in some of the couple of bigger towns, there are still Jewish institutions that have programs out there. And the local provincial governments have created sort of a tourist theme industry where you have, among other theme tours, you can go to Entre Rios and do a car tour of Jewish colonies and the museums that at each town that celebrate that particular town. And you can also do one about the old railroad network, since they no longer exist, for your railroad buffs. But the idea of Jewish life in the colonies and its connection to the rest of the Jewish community in Buenos Aires is still very strong. Buenos Aires AMIA, which is the communal federation that runs many of the services in Argentina, has an entire division of rural services, which provides support to small Jewish communities scattered through the interior of the country, some in the old colonies, some in small rural towns. And that's how I learned a lot of this stuff during the pandemic. I audited on Zoom several lectures about the colony. There have been movies made about based on the Jewish Gauchos in the early 1970s or late 1960s. There was a nice big musical. It's kind of like Fiddler on the Roof, but set in Moisesville, and based on some of the anecdotes in the Jewish Gauchos. But the most interesting part is the museum of the Jewish Community Museum, the Jewish History Museum, that is adjacent to a very large and imposing synagogue on Libertad Street, the center of Buenos Aires. The synagogue, of course, is still active, and this is an educational center as well. But when you go visit the museum, the first room that you see is a room dedicated to the colonies. You could see a model of the Vessel, the ship that brought the initial colonists. It has, documents, maps, pictures of people in the colonies. It has saddles, blankets, bolos, which are the things that you use to knock down cattle in the country that was picked up from the native population. And then you have all these things about the colony. And then the next thing, you start having things like ritual Jewish objects and an example of a traditional Shabbat table and pictures about Jewish life in Buenos Aires. And what is interesting is that the adjacent synagogue, the synagogue on Libertad Synagogue, is the direct descendant of the small Jewish community that was organized in the 1860s. So when those immigrants arrived and had all this trouble with their contract and starving, they were getting aid from this very small but organized group of Jews who already lived in Buenos Aires, maybe 1,000, maybe a few thousand, which consisted of professionals, English, French, German, who were living, professional and commercial people. But the museum moves them later on in the order of the history and the presentation, self-presentation of Jews in Buenos Aires. And if you think about the Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia, we start out with Charleston and New York and the early colonial Jewish communities and Rhode Island. And then after stuff about the Lower East Side and everything like that, in a side alcove on your way to the big model of a Jewish community center, there is some things about the Jewish agricultural colonies in New Jersey and about the Jewish agricultural school in Doylestown, sort of a minor under a minor footnote. And in Buenos Aires, it might be overly emphasized, but everyone in Argentina would tell you, if they have, what their connection is to the colonies. They were introducing themselves. They say, well, Enid had introduced us to someone that was a friend of hers in Buenos Aires. We got in touch with her. We met with her. We went out with her to dinner and to a museum. But she made it a point when I was talking to her to let me know, and she was very proud of this fact, that her great-grandfather was one of those teachers that had been brought by the Baron Hirsch to teach. I don't know if it was, I don't remember now if it was Mosesville or one of the other towns, but the family began its life in a Jewish colony as a Yiddish teacher, and then the family moved to Buenos Aires. And other people, both Jews and non-Jews, if they have that connection to the country, will point out that they come from, at least in some part of their family, from somebody who at one point had been a Gaucho. The other anecdote, Jewish anecdote, and then I'll stop, is that many years ago, when I was reading a food column about, I don't know, it was about Passover from Jean Nathan, Phyllis?
Joan.
What?
Joan.
Joan Nathan, yeah. So she was interviewing this Jewish diplomat from Argentina. I can't remember if it was ambassador to the United States or to the UN, equally important for Argentina. He made it a point when discussing his reminiscences of Passover. It was an article about Passover, how his mother had made kosher for Passover chimichurri sauce. I mean, not just that they had kosher meat or how they got their matzah. But what stuck in my mind was, because this is the most typical Argentinian dish. This is what you eat with your beef, and you eat beef all the time. And she made kosher for Passover chimichurri sauce. And that stuck in my mind because that was how he was Jewish and Argentinian. And now I'm going to stop because I think I went over my time.
Yep. Thank you so much, Natan. Does anybody, I do want to close this out, but does anybody have any pressing questions? Evie?
Natan, I want to know what you're going to prepare for us to listen to next time. This was wonderful. You really opened my eyes to so much.
I'm not on this schedule. I may do
We'll talk
something
about
at
it.
Ollie, and I'm just advertising Ollie for those of you who live in New York, in Philadelphia, about Jews in all over Latin America.
Great. Roby?
She's muted.
Roby, you have to unmute. Roby, you have to, there you go.
Yeah.
There were a bunch of Dutch Jews who also went to Argentina. I think maybe even one of my family members. And was that more like in the 1930s when things got rough in Europe? Or have you known Dutch Jews in Argentina? Because it sounds familiar to me somewhere, but I can't put my finger on it.
Yeah, but I
Well,
think
I wouldn't be surprised. Argentina was one of those places in the 1930s, despite other limitations, where Jews could still go to. I mean, it was difficult, and it was because of Jews in Western Europe and in Germany, Central Germany, Dutch, that a Victor was founded at that point, because that was the last time, and there was another colony done in Brazil. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised they went to Argentina, most likely to Buenos Aires.
Yeah, that's what I think.
Yeah, because that's where you could go.
so.
Okay, thank
Natan, I want to thank you so much. I learned so much from this. And, you know, even about the Italians, I knew there was this strong Italian flavor, community, whatever in Argentina, but I never looked into where it came from. So this was really, really interesting. We can't thank you enough for putting your time and energy into this.
Well, the Italians did not come from Salerno like the ones in New York.
Right.
They came from the north.
Yeah.
And I think it has to do with the timing of Italian migration.
Yep. Okay, everybody. Take care. Roby, if you're talking to us, we cannot hear you. And I am
Thank
gonna,
you, Natan.
yeah, if everybody wants to unmute and just thank Natan, that would be great. And
Thank
everybody
you.
have a good week.
Thank you. Gracias.
Make announcements, but we do have a lot going on. If you're not sure
Thank
what,
you, Natan.
check our web calendar. Okay, and Helene and Andrea, you know that you're welcome to join us anytime for our programs. Good to have you with us. Okay, everybody, have a good day.
Thanks, Natan. It was great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, I just caught the end.
Take care.